Oops, started at the wrong place. Let's see. We'll try again. Okay, now we're in shape. And the Torah portion is Vaetchanan, which means, and I pleaded. And of course, it's Moses who's pleading. Remember, Moses wants to cross over and he wants to see the land. And all this is going to fit into this context of the 3 weeks, then the 9 days, the counting toward Tisha B'Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temples, the evil report of the spies, in which they were told they weren't going to be able to enter in that generation. And so we're going to take it from there and see if we can take a closer look at Moses. Remember we said in Bamidbar, it was like a different Moses than the one that we knew in Shemot. He was a little crankier, a little short-tempered, a little more exasperated, frustrated, and but I think we can still look at Moses and ask some questions of Moses and say, okay, Moses, give us the bigger picture of what's going on here, other than just the fact that you long to be able to cross over the Jordan and to see the land. You want to see more than the eastern side. And so the readings in Vaetchanan are going to be Deuteronomy 3:23 through 7:11, Isaiah 40:1 through 26, Psalm 90, and 1 John 2:12 through 14. And I had to do this in a hurry this week. I had some company this weekend, and then I had vegetables in the garden that had to be canned today. So I did this on one pass, and there might be lots of misspellings, and definitely check the numbers. And if you see something crazy, just put it over there in the chat box, and then hopefully I can get it corrected before tomorrow's class. So let's review. We're going to pull the thread from Devarim, and the part I want to focus on is what Moshe says when he reminds them of how they lost heart at the report of the 10 spies. And Moses tries to encourage them. And in Deuteronomy 1:28, he said, don't be shocked. Don't fear them. Don't fear the obstacles to going into the land. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes and in the wilderness, where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, in all the way which you have walked until you came into this place. So Devarim begins with, even though it seems like it's a big lecture, and it seems a little dark as it starts out, one of the most beautiful things he can do to draw us into the text is to use this reminder of the relationship between a father and a child. And so when you're speaking of a relationship between a father and a child, I think it mitigates some of that harshness of the things that Moses is about to say and about to remind them of. And that's kind of, I want to stay on that theme in Vaetchanan. So just to review, especially for those of you who are newer to the calendar, and you might still be having trouble placing the feasts into the proper month, much less the fasts into the proper month. Just to review, we know that the fast of the 9th of Av, which if I'm not mistaken will fall on Thursday of this week. I'll have to look at back at the calendar and make sure. On the 9th of Av, it was decreed upon our ancestors that they would not be allowed to enter the land of Israel, which Moses reminded them of in last week's Torah portion. The first and second temples were destroyed. Beitar was captured, and there's a story there that's worth reading about, because the significance of it is that when the students of Rabbi Akiva, who identified a false Messiah, and then there was a great slaughter of his students, and part of the information that we should know about Beitar is that it's all mixed in there with this baseless hatred that the disciples had of this particular rabbi. And so when Rabbi Akiva's students could not get along, this was seen as part of the calamity. And so Beitar being captured is important in that respect, because it's just part of this general understanding of why was the temple destroyed? Baseless hatred between brothers. And I think Yeshua's death factored into that as well. We could see even in the Gospels what deep divides there were among the Jews in the first century. You know, much less their gripes with the Romans and the Greeks and the whoever's. And so tomorrow's class, I want to talk a little bit about Tu B'Av, which is the 15th of Av. And this particular tragedy will be tied to that as well, because it will be the date that those corpses were permitted to be buried. The city of Jerusalem was plowed over. So it says from when the month of Av starts, we reduce joy. So the 9 days began on the 1st of Av, which is the 5th month. It's part of the 3 weeks that we began counting on the 17th of Tammuz, or the 4th month. And you already know now that there are certain customs practiced during those 3 weeks, and even more that are done during the 9 days, such as not eating meat or drinking wine during this period, which commemorates that the sacrifices and the wine libations in the Holy Temple ceased during this time. So not eating meat too and drinking wine, we can trace back also to the habits of Daniel and his companions, that when they were in a period of testing and a time of calamity, then they fasted meat and wine. And so the exception to that would be meat and wine that you would consume as part of a Shabbat, as part of oneg or joy that is commanded. Or like a circumcision would be a special occasion where you might drink the wine. But in general, the period is one of mourning. And Devarim, which we read last week, will always fall during the 9 days that are leading up to Tisha B'Av. And those rebukes that you read last week in Devarim, they're very consistent with the calamities that occurred at this season. So this week's Torah portion, Vaetchanan, will always follow Tisha B'Av. And again, as we look into this Torah portion, we can see those strong connections to all the calamities. And the great thing about this particular Torah portion, always following on, this period of Tisha B'Av, falling within this period of Tisha B'Av, is that it has the remedy. It has the prescription. We say, oh my goodness, I'm fasting, I'm praying. I know this is a calamitous time. It's a perilous time. The great news is that within the Torah portion, he recaps the Shema. And it's understanding the Shema that really is the one thing that's going to turn the key in terms of making sure not only do we not personally recommit the behaviors and the attitudes that led to those great calamities, but understanding how we're part of a community that believes in the unity and the oneness of Adonai. And so it restates that belief in Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac, the God of Abraham. And so this belief in one God, you say, well, what can people do in this period if they are just severely, sorely backslidden, if they got a long way to go to get, to where they would need to be on solid footing? What is one thing they can do at this season? What if they're praying and saying, oh my goodness, I've not been faithful to Yeshua. I've not, tried to conform myself to the image of Elohim. I've made all these mistakes. What do I do? When you can't do anything else, remember what Yeshua said. What's the greatest commandment? What's the one thing you can do that can represent everything else you should have done? That would be a good faith step. It would be, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. It's a recommitment to that belief. If you've allowed other powers to come into your life, and it doesn't mean that you disbelieve in the supremacy of Adonai. Sometimes it just means that what you believe and how you behave are two different things. Because sometimes in the course of a day, we can forget that Adonai is in charge of the world, and we can begin to think that politicians run the world, that governments run the world, that military run the world, that conspiracies run the world. There's a whole list of things that we allow to worry and distress us rather than committing ourselves to the fear of Adonai. And we all do that. We can all be distracted by giving too much attention to those powers, which really aren't powers at all. And so what do? We say, okay, I know this is a calamitous season, and it's also a season where I'm beginning to think about readying myself for the feasts of the 7th month. What can I do? Vaetchanan tells us what you need to do is recommit to the belief in one God and all that goes with that. Because remember, the commandments are going to hang on two things: the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and love your neighbor as yourself. They're really the same thing. If you're good in one, you're probably good in the other. That's how those pair together. So that one commitment, if you don't know another prayer to pray, and I'm functioning here on the assumption that you've had a salvation experience with Yeshua. But if you're at a loss for words, there's never anything wrong with just praying the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And then I think the words will come to you. They'll come easier. So here's an example of how the Shema really embodies that prescription. If you look at Deuteronomy 7, 9 through, let's see. Now let's go to Deuteronomy 4:35. We'll do them in order. It says, to you it was shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God. There is no other beside him. Then in verse 39, it says, know therefore today and take it to your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and on the earth below. There is no other. And then in Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 8, which is a repeat of the 10 Commandments, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or on the earth or in the water under the earth. And then again in Deuteronomy 7, 9, he says, know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness to 1,000th generation with those who love him and keep his commandments, but repays those who hate him to their faces to destroy them. He will not delay with him who hates him. He will repay him to his face. So other than the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, we have 4 passages here where he restates in some way a reminder that there's no one else other than him. And so at this time of mourning, where we're in mourning for these past calamities of unrepentance, we also have the expectation that one day these days of mourning will be turned into days of joy and dancing. And in the rabbinic expectation, which we'll get a little bit more into tomorrow, we'll see that there's also a messianic expectation tied to that it will be because of the messianic age, that it will be because of the coming of Messiah, that these fast days will be turned into days of joy and dancing. And it's also an expectation, because see, we can see this back here, like in Deuteronomy 7:9-10, that there are those who keep the covenant, who are faithful and love him, but those who hate him, it says he's going to destroy. He's going to, it says he will repay him to his face. And the positioning here, just following in the season of, just depends on where it falls in the week, Tisha B'Av. When we think of a time of Tisha B'Av, one day we won't be thinking about it as a calamity upon the temple and upon the people of Adonai. One day we will think of this as a day where he repaid those who hated him. That's what was destroyed, not the temple, not Israel, not Judah. Instead, it will be a day known for destroying the enemy. Which, bad news if you're an enemy, good news if you're righteous. But as we look through the portion, we can see that, yeah, there's a recap here of some of the basic tenets of the faith, especially this emphasis and caution against idolatry. But other than that, there's not really a lot of new information in Vaetchanan. But there is one thing we want to take a look at, and that's the establishment of the refuge cities for the manslayer. And oddly, at this particular time, Moses wants to talk about refuge cities, even though he's not going to be able to go over to the other side of the Jordan, even though he's not going to be the one to set up these cities. For some reason, he wants to talk about these 3 cities for the manslayer. And the ones he's interested in at this point, because remember, Joshua is going to have to be part of it, setting these things up after they cross over and they begin to conquer the land. But the 3 that Moses is interested in, and names by name, are those on the eastern side of the Jordan, which, remember, this is customarily where exiles went. They were sent east. We also see that there's a strong emphasis on the sin at Peor. So again, he's linking this, what would later come to be a link to the destruction of the temple. Because see, he's making the link here between idolatry and adultery or sexual licentiousness that occurred with the Midianites and the Moabites at Baal Peor. And so see, it's underpinning here, the Shema is underpinning this, because if you had truly shmad and heard that he was one, then you would not have been lured into idolatry. If he was truly the strong power of your life, then you would not have been lured into sexual licentiousness. And you would not be tempted to dally with another god. And that's what adultery, it's that natural picture of a spiritual adultery. So he says, be on the alert for things like idolatry. Be on the alert for things like murder, that or killing a person that might lead you to have to flee to a refuge city. Be on the alert for sexual sin. Be on alert for things that separate brothers. Because during this season, they are recompensed very harshly. Those things destroyed the temples. Those sins destroyed the temples. And so I say at this time, it's not the time to be playing, not that there's any time. There's not any time you should be playing with those things. But this is going to be a time of extreme caution. So I wanted to look at the first mention. Our Torah portion is Vaetchanan. I wanted to find the first mention of Hanan, which was a bit of a challenge because at least the 2-letter root has so many different words that spin off of it. But in terms of specifically Hanan and not Chana, I found a first mention, or at least this is what the lexicon is telling me, in Genesis 33:5. And once I went there, it made a whole lot of sense. And in Genesis 33:5, it says he, and it's referring to Esau. It's referring to the meeting between Esau and Jacob when Jacob comes back to the land. It says, Esau lifted his eyes and saw the women and children and said, who are these with you? So he said, the children whom God has graciously given to your servant. And so in Hebrew, I included that there on the slide so that you could see how it's used. Chanan Elohim et Abdecha. He has graciously given these children to your servant. And what I wanted you to see is that within this one verse and this small context, he uses the word yeladim, which means children, twice. And remember, when you see a repetition, when you see a pair like that, sometimes what you're supposed to look for is if there's a physical picture there, and in this case, physical children, he would have had 12 children total, 11 sons and 1 daughter at this point, because I don't think Benjamin was born yet. So you got a dozen kids. And does Esau see them? Yes, he does. But he sees more than just those physical children. At any rate, he says, okay, who are these? And Jacob mentions that they were graciously given to him, Hanan. And so in Moses' plea, Vaetchanan, and I pleaded, because I wanted to go into the land. You can see that in this first context here, it's in a context of undeserved grace. Jacob saying, I didn't deserve it. Nevertheless, he says, God has graciously given these children to me. And so now we can unpack Moses' plea and realize how deeply he's pleading. He's saying, I don't deserve it. And he's throwing himself on the attributes of mercy. Remember the 13 attributes of mercy? When he wants to see Adonai, when he's interceding for forgiveness for Israel, and he passes by and he names these attributes of mercy that tell who he is. Well, this is exactly what Moses is doing now. He's calling on the mercy of Adonai. In Vaetchanan, he says, I know I don't deserve to go into the land, but could I please go anyway? You've given grace. You've given undeserved grace to our ancestors like Jacob. You gave him children he said he didn't deserve. How about me? And so at any rate, our clue here is it says Esau lifts his eyes when he sees the children. So he's not just seeing natural children. Otherwise, why would he really say, who are these? It's obvious Jacob has left home, gotten married, and returned. And that, I mean, that's like Captain Obvious at this point. But Esau sees something that would provoke him to ask, who are these? So he's obviously seeing more than just a dozen kids. Because lifting your eyes is an idiom for having spiritual vision, higher vision, a glimpse of prophecy. And so we can see then how these two passages are connected, are linked together with Hanan. Because Moses is pleading in Vaetchanan, please let me cross over with the children. I want to cross over with the children of Israel. I don't deserve to cross over with the children of Israel, but please let me cross over. And he's saying, you know, even though the natural children of these tribes that Esau prophetically saw, even though the natural children died because of their natural cravings, there's another generation. There's a generation that's going to believe. There's two childrens. There's the children after the flesh, and then there's the children after the spirit. And Moses wants to cross over with this next generation of Yeladim. And so he connects it, at least in terms of first mention, again to Elohim's undeserved grace toward Jacob. He said, give me that kind of grace so that I can cross into the land, so that I can cross over Jordan and not just have to be content with seeing the south of it and the east of it. There's something special about crossing the Jordan. And it looks like Moses is evoking a remembrance of the grace that was bestowed upon the ancestors, upon the fathers. And so here's what he says in Deuteronomy 3:23. He says, I also pleaded Vaetchanan with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such mighty works and mighty acts as yours? There again, it's consistent with the uniqueness and the oneness of Adonai. So he says, let me, I pray. Wake up. Let me, I pray, cross over and see the fair land that is beyond the Jordan, that good hill country and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, enough. Speak to me no more of this matter. Now ask yourself why Moses just said these things. If he said don't speak to me anymore about it, why is Moses speaking about it? Although he's doing it in kind of a roundabout way. He says, go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes to the west and the north and the south and the east and see it with your eyes. For you shall not cross over this Jordan, but charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him. For he shall go across at the head of this people, and he will give them as an inheritance the land which you will see. So we remained in the valley opposite Beit Peor. And again, he's mentioning the adultery that took place there, the idolatry and the adultery. And that's our question of the day. Why is Moses bringing up his continued prayers when the Israelites already know he's been denied entry into the fullness of the land? Why is he going over this again? It's already settled. He's only going to see that portion east of the Jordan. Why does he bring it up? So let's ask some more questions. I'll probably ask a lot of questions today. Is it true that the road to hell is paved with good intentions? And is there another side to that old adage? Could there possibly be another side to our failures in the pursuit of the kingdom? Maybe there is another side to hopeless prayer. Because we realize at this point that Moses has been praying hopeless prayers. And what does James tell us? The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Well, it didn't get Moses into the land. Nevertheless, he prays, he pleads, he appeals, he tells about praying. And so maybe Moses can teach us something about hopeless prayer. Because I don't know about you guys, but I have frequently felt like I was praying a hopeless prayer. Something I desperately wanted to happen, but I kind of knew I wasn't going to get it. Unless there was a huge miracle, there just wasn't any way that the future was going to change because I prayed. And I think that's part of where we are. And I think that's why we need to look at Moses as a pattern and say, should we be praying hopeless prayers? In a sense, we can ask ourselves the same question about keeping the mitzvot when we're not in the land of Israel, when there's certain commandments that are impossible to keep if you don't live in the land of Israel, when there's certain commandments that are impossible to keep if there's no temple in the land of Israel. And so if we're not even permitted to live in the land, and if Israel's not even permitted to build a temple, then aren't we doing a bunch of commandments kind of hopelessly? And I think Moses is going to give us an answer, that there's going to be some things we do today. There's going to be some prayers we pray today. There's going to be some commandments we keep today that are only going to be honored, answered, or revealed in the days of Mashiach. And that's what Paul writes to the Colossians in Colossians 3:4. He says, when Mashiach, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. And I think that's a hint that yes, we are going to pray some hopeless prayers. They're not going to be answered the way that we want, but maybe they are being answered, just not now. There's going to be commandments we keep that really can't be kept in their fullness until we do cross over the Jordan. But the assurance we have is that when Mashiach is revealed, which again, this is a very messianic expectation, this period of the 9 days that we're in. When he's revealed, then there's going to be some things revealed in us as well, some things that just weren't evident before Mashiach came. So let's look at this pattern. Let's answer that question. Should we pray hopeless prayers? And should we keep commandments when maybe they're never going to be completely in the context of being in the land or there being a functioning temple? In other words, we're keeping that commandment, but not in an ideal situation. Sometimes scripture seems to presume an ideal situation that we know we are definitely not in. So let's start with Reuven. Remember, hearing is the theme of Vaetchanan. And last week we talked about how Moses sent them out with see, but then when they come back, they're coming back in, he sends them out with see. Reuven, the tribe of Reuven, is unique to that 4th month. And then bringing them back to Shimon, hear, just like we hear in Vaetchanan, hear, O Israel. Okay, they come back and they want to give this report in a month where they're supposed to hear. And so we're told, as we go back to this incident where the brothers are jealous of Joseph, they're angry with Joseph, and they want to kill him. He's been sent to Shechem to check on them and to bring back a report to his father. And up to this point, apparently they've all been evil reports. And so the brothers decide they want to kill him. And the passage says, Reuven heard. And he protests. He says, do not spill innocent blood. Okay, right here, I think we can begin to make a connection as to why Moshe is concerned about cities of refuge on the eastern side of the Jordan, because this is where Reuven is going to receive his inheritance. So this positions Reuven with the ability to hear and to react. And he speaks up. He says, do not spill innocent blood. Cast him into one of the pits instead. And when we know that Reuven's name means see a son, and he's the firstborn. So when he hears of the murderous plan, then he takes it upon himself to see to the rescue of a son and to take Yosef back to their father. He's living up to his name, see a son. At this point, the other brothers don't really see Yosef as anything but a threat. But even though Reuven is the one who is being damaged the most by Yosef and his relationship to the father, nevertheless, it is Reuven who hears and decides, I'm going to take care of my brother. I'll come back when they're not here. I'll get him out of the pit and I'll take him back and I'll give him back to our father. He's really living up to his name at that point. And so now maybe we can understand why in Vaetchanan, Moses strangely stops and prescribes 3 refuge cities east of the Jordan, even though they're not going to be activated until Yehoshua conquers and sets up the larger number of cities west of the Jordan and the tribal territories. And so we have to ask ourselves, why is he preparing something that's not even been achieved by that present generation? But he takes time out in the Vaetchanan and says, you know what? The honor of establishing the first refuge city is going to go to the tribe of Reuven, who, even though he couldn't follow through on his intention to rescue Yosef, his intention to do so was there. And there's so many things in our lives we genuinely intend to do good things. We genuinely intend to keep the commandments. We genuinely intend to do deeds of kindness. We genuinely intend to reform our behavior. And sometimes the job is incomplete. Sometimes, in this case, there's even a greater plan afoot because Joseph needs to go down to Egypt. Reuven can't complete this good intention. He can't finish the mitzvah that he started. And therefore, what we see is that even though he couldn't finish the mitzvah of rescuing a son of Jacob, nevertheless, generations later, the honor of having the first refuge city for an inadvertent killer is given to his tribe in his territory. And so he preserved Joseph's life. He preserved his brothers' lives by at least slowing them down and their intentions so that they didn't kill him before Judah came up with his bright idea. He preserved a relationship between his brothers and his father. And so we can see that even though we could say, well, his good intention didn't save Joseph, maybe it did. Maybe this is what Moses is telling us. Maybe we can start out to do good things. And maybe we feel like we just didn't finish it. We didn't finish strong. And Moses is saying, it's okay. You intended to do well. You didn't fail on purpose. You failed because you were human, and you failed because there are other humans in the world who will obstruct those good intentions. So it's better to go ahead to pray a hopeless prayer. It's better to go ahead and begin a mitzvah, even if something interrupts you and you can't complete it. Now, we're not talking about taking a foolish vow. We're talking about beginning a good deed that maybe you're going to be interrupted and you can't finish it, or you can't do that good deed in the ideal situation. Maybe you can tithe, but you can't tithe in the land of Israel and you can't take it to the temple. But he says, what is your intention? Is your intention to remember my commandment and to do what you can, when you can, where you can? Maybe there will be no reward for that beginning of a mitzvah in this lifetime, but when Messiah comes, then maybe you will realize what a bright and shining intention you had and how bright that mitzvah shined, even though you felt like it just wasn't the same, as if you had been able to do it in an ideal situation. So even though Reuven's intention to save is not usually heralded as a great mitzvah, because you know what we're doing? We're always comparing him to Judah. We know Reuven had some problems. And poor Reuven, his legacy has always been to be compared to Judah, who finally goes and offers himself in the place of Benjamin. But sometimes we slide right by in our rush to hold up the excellence of Judah. In the end, we forget about Reuven's salvation in the beginning, because without that salvation, there would have been no opportunity for Judah to step up. So even though we might forget Reuven's salvation, he did delay the murder so that it could not take place. It was not forgotten by the one who does see and the one who does hear. And here's what we also forget. Reuven is the one whose position that Joseph was threatening. He was the firstborn. And we can tell from Joseph's dreams that he has illusions or dreams that he's going to supplant his brothers. And as Jacob interprets it, you're even going to have your mother and father bow down to you. So of all the brothers, Reuven should have been the one who felt the most threatened. If anybody should have been plotting murder, it should have been Reuven. But he's the one who steps up. And so in this portion, we can see that sometimes a good deed that is diminished by others, that is looked down upon by others, that is completely missed by others because we're being compared to some other shining example. Sometimes what we don't realize is that maybe our kind of success, kind of failure sets somebody else up for their huge success. Like they said, there would have been no sacrifice of Judah or Benjamin had Reuven not taken the responsibility for his brother to try to rescue him. And so his descendants are honored as being the first tribe who can preserve life in Israel's future family disputes, because we know those family disputes, especially in that day and time, could lead to very prolonged, never-ending clan wars. In fact, if you go to the Middle East today, you'll still find that. Once the war starts among the clans, it never stops. And so even though only Adonai himself was capable of the full rescue of Joseph, because there were so many steps in the plan, that first step of intention was enough to keep Joseph alive. In the same way, Moses stops and he sees in the future that these cities of refuge will be set up, even though it's not he who will set them up. It will be Yehoshua who will have to see to them. So let's take that first example of Reuven. Even though it was an incomplete, maybe in his eyes, mitzvah, because he's grief-stricken that when he goes back to retrieve Joseph, he's been sold. So imagine, how many times we have failed and we're grief-stricken because we just say to ourselves, if I had only taken the opportunity, if I had only done this, if I had only done that. But if you genuinely had an intention of following through for good, then don't beat yourself up just yet. Because what you may find out that it took just that fragment of your good deed to set the stage for something greater. And without your little intention in your eyes, there would have been no great success later. So in Vaetchanan, we can see that Moses recognizes that Reuben did have a heart for the lives of his brothers. He had a heart for the well-being of his father. And what we also see is that even Moses is going to benefit from this early designation of the refuge cities as well. You say, well, how does he benefit from it? Well, look how many commandments Moses taught the Israelites that they couldn't keep. Wandering around in exile in the desert, they're learning all these commandments for the temple and tithing and all this stuff they can't do because they're not in the land. There's not a temple. There's so many things that they don't have, but yet they are learning for 40 years how to do commandments they can't really do. And so Moses is honored as that teacher of commandments, many of which could not be kept, sometimes until hundreds of years after his death, until the times of the kings, until the times of the temple. But look how Deuteronomy 4:41 reads. It says, then Moses, and I think I took this out of NASB, but then I put the Hebrew so that you could see the verb tense of it. In NASB, it reads, then Moses set apart 3 cities across the Jordan to the east. But you can see in the Hebrew, it says, Az Yavdil Moshe. And he will set apart 3 cities. So here's the problem. Moses is going to be dead when those 3 cities are set up. Nevertheless, he's being given the credit for setting up those cities. Just like Moses is given credit for teaching commandments that cannot yet be kept. And so there's little hints like this in Scripture. And even though Joshua is going to be the one to bring the literal fulfillment of those refuge cities, Moses does get credit for having the vision for them, seeing the need for them. I mean, he had his experience of running after killing an Egyptian. He knew the terror of not being able to trust anybody, not knowing where to go, not wanting to close his eyes at night. So he has the vision, he has the determination, and he has the heart to establish a place of refuge to preserve life. And so he gets credit. His intention. Moses will do it. Even though Joshua did it, Moses will do it. Okay, our third example. David was told that he would not be permitted to build the first temple. Instead of being offended and, saying, I've done all these great things for you, I've been so wonderful, I've written all these Psalms, I've been obedient. I've been chased around the countryside for years by a king who has been anointed, but then he lost his position because of wickedness and not obeying and rebellion. Instead of bringing up all the arguments, kind of like Moses does, we don't really see that in David. Instead, David goes to work. David, whose heart is to build a house for Adonai, starts purchasing and acquiring all the necessary building materials. He purchases the site of the Temple Mount. He reorganized the priesthood and Levitical system to be more efficient for the permanent structure that was coming. And even though it was his son Shlomo who was literally going to build the house, nevertheless, it was called David's house because it was his intention, it was his heart, it was his vision, it was his determination. And so David got credit. In addition, we know that he composed so many psalms that were sung on a daily basis at the feasts and so forth in the temple, at its services. In fact, David even composed the psalms for the temple's dedication. We see that in Psalm 30, verse 1. So can you imagine writing the score to a song, composing the melody to a song that's going to be sung at the greatest dedication of anything the world had ever seen up to that time, and you wouldn't be there to perform it, to hear anybody else perform it? You wouldn't see it. But David did see it. He saw it because he heard it. Because he didn't become offended that he would not be able to completely fulfill the mitzvah. He just keeps on. He does what he can with determination, with intention. He prepares, just like Moses prepares refuge cities, just like Reuben prepared a refuge for his brother. They may have had the intention, they didn't get to see it through. Doesn't matter. They did what they could up until the point that they were stopped through circumstances beyond their control. So let's look at the wording. That might help us here. It says in the wording that then Moses set apart 3 cities. The wording there, which I showed you on another slide, but it says, as Yavdil Moshe. Right? That's in our Torah portion, Vaetchanan. But the grammar of it matches another place. It matches Exodus 15:1. And that is, as Yashil Moshe. And that's after the destruction of Pharaoh and his chariots. And they began to sing the song of the sea. And so then Moses set apart 3 cities is a parallel structure to then Moses sang and the sons of Israel this song. So when we sing the prayers of Israel, it's speaking prophecy. When we sing the prayers of Israel, it's a vision of the kingdom. When we sing the prayers of Israel, it's the expectation of Mashiach. It's the expectation of its temple. And so when Moses sang the Song of the Sea with the children of Israel, they are commemorating a miraculous destruction of Pharaoh and his chariots. But like we've seen before, they are also prophesying of a time, a future time, when another Pharaoh, a dark force called Egypt, and its chariots will also be destroyed. It's a prophecy. So that's why we do what we can do at the time that we can do it, and we have to be content that maybe we are only given a step of something that's going to take 1,000 generations to be fulfilled. We don't get our feelings hurt. Instead, we prepare, we prepare, we prepare. We speak words of prophecy, prophecy, prophecy. We sing the prayers, the prayers, the prayers. And with the right intention, the reward of that, we will see the completion of what we started when Mashiach is revealed in the age of Messiah. So let's go back to the question. Why does Moses mention pleading for grace to enter the land of Israel by crossing the Jordan at this point in Devarim? We have a contextual clue now. We have Reuven's honor of a refuge city. And this is an honor of the first refuge city, which goes back to the honor of being the first son. It's an honor that is given in spite of Reuven's failures, in spite of his descendants' rebellion against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. But Moses prepares Reuven's refuge city in faith, and he uses that similar phrasing. Again, the similar grammar structures. Then Moses sang. Then Moses separated the 3 refuge cities. And so if we put those two contexts together, we can see that the children of Israel sang a song of prophecy and thanksgiving for an extraordinary act of grace on their behalf. They join with Moses in singing a song of prophecy. They joined with Moses in singing a song of prophecy. I'm trying to help you here. They joined with him. And maybe this is what Moses is hoping. He knows it's pointless to keep asking the Holy One if he can go into the land. But you know what? The Holy One has made pronouncements against Israel in the wilderness that he didn't follow through on because Moses interceded for them. He prayed for them. Maybe now, by recounting these events in just this way, Moses is hoping that they will once again join him in his song, in his plead across the Jordan. Vaetchanan, I pleaded. When he says that, is he pausing so that maybe they will begin to pray and intercede with the Holy One on his behalf? Will they hear him? Will they see his plea? Will they pray with him? Will they pray for him? If you go through Vaetchanan, and we've just come through Devarim, look how many times the Israelites were in a scrape, and Moses intercedes, and he pleads for them. He prays on their behalf. Let me go get that. And maybe he's thinking they would do the same for him at this point. They would fall on their faces and plead for him. I was wondering where that went. But I think this is why Moses brings up at this point his failure at the rock. It was an opportunity to teach the Israelites how to speak to the rock. Remember, he wasn't told to strike the rock this time. He says, speak to the rock. And because he struck the rock, instead of speaking to the rock, he couldn't go into the land. And we saw when we covered that section how it was an opportunity to teach the Israelites a different way of coping, other than the way they had been coping up to this point. The point was to teach them how to pray for water, to speak to the rock, instead of complaining to Moses and Aaron. And that's what Moses and Aaron were supposed to do. They were supposed to model to the Israelites how to pray, to instruct them in a better way that would save their lives, a better way they could pass on to their children. That if when we have a need, when we have a want, when we have a distress, when we have a complaint, turn to the Holy One in those needs and in those fears, rather than complain, grumble, rebel. If he could show them, if he could model that prayer for them, then they would understand at that point this higher level of intimacy that was going to be possible with the Holy One, and not just possible, but a requirement. See, if you're going to live in the land of Israel, there's a level of intimacy that had to be maintained. Otherwise, you get no water. You start worshiping idols, you get no water. You start building up high places, you get no water. You begin sexual licentiousness, you're going to get plagues. And so all the things that they've been warned against, it's for a reason, because they're not going to be able to live in the land committing those sins, not for long. And they're definitely not going to be able to live as we understand it. That higher existence, that level of the supernatural that they have been enjoying up to this point. And so at this point, they could develop that intimacy in prayer. Here's how you do it. You just speak to the rock when you need water. And so connecting this lesson in Vaetchanan, he says, and I pleaded. See, this is what should have happened at the rock. The people should have pleaded with Moses for water, instead of making him angry, and then he ends up striking the rock. And he says, it's because of this that I can't go in. He's trying to help them make this connection between the two things. And he even reminds them in Deuteronomy 4:21, he says, now the Lord was angry with me on your account and swore that I would not cross the Jordan and that I would not enter the good land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. For I will die in this land. I shall not cross the Jordan, but you shall cross and take possession of this good land. So watch yourselves that you do not forget the covenant of the Lord your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a graven image in the form of anything against which the Lord your God has commanded you. And so what is he saying here? Don't make a graven image. What's he reminding them of? At the incident of the golden calf, and remember these fast days are connecting all these dates for us, by the way. But he reminds them of the golden calf. And so therefore, hopefully they would remember how he interceded for them when they made a graven image. They had already known, they had just received the 10 Commandments. They knew not to make a graven image. And so now he's bringing this up again. And in Vaetchanan, what does he do? He repeats the 10 Commandments, including the one, don't make a graven image. But see, if he can connect today to Mount Horeb, the 10 Commandments at Mount Horeb, the failure at Mount Horeb, their failure at Mount Horeb, and how he interceded for them, maybe he's hoping that as he brings up these memories and connects these events, they'll say, you know what? We're going to intercede for you, Moses. We know he said that you couldn't ask, but he didn't say we couldn't intercede for you. And time after time, we know this. Moses keeps interceding with these jaw-dropping prayers, especially after the golden calf, when they made the image. Because in Exodus 32:32, he says, but now if you will, forgive their sin, and if not, please blot me out from your book, which you have written. And so Exodus 14:15, he says, now if you slay this people as one man, then the nations who have heard of your fame will say, because the Lord could not bring this people into the land which he promised them by oath. Therefore, he slaughtered them in the wilderness. But now I pray, see, it's prayer. Let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you also have forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. He's reminding them of how he prayed for them after the golden calf, reminding them of how he intercedes after the evil report of the 10 spies. And he reminds them that he invoked the greatness of his loving kindness, just like with Vaetchanan. I pleaded, he connects it to the undeserved grace that Jacob was given, not just to be given the Yeladim, his natural children, and then all the descendants of Jacob, the children, the spiritual children that would descend from him, and to be able to cross back over into the land with that undeserved mercy. And Moses connects these things. In fact, Adonai offered, he says, okay, Moses, stand back. I'll just make up a brand new nation. I'll take your descendants and make a nation out of you. You'll be like Abraham. And I think that's what he's doing. He repeats the Shema. He repeats the 10 Commandments. Maybe he's hoping that this generation will remember how he interceded for their parents, and they would in turn plead also for him. He mentions visiting the iniquity of their fathers until the third and fourth generation. But you know what? They're the next generation, and they're about to enter in. Can they see how his intercession has changed their generation's, I don't want to call it fate, but what they will be allowed to do? And I think this dark lecture is really his hope, that nationwide he could knit together this new generation's heart to the last's by mentioning his own prayers. That in spite of the jagged edges in the generation before, just like Reuven had his jagged edges, Moses had his jagged edges. In spite of that, their mitzvot, their intercession, their prayers, preserved even that diamond in the rough. Because without those diamond prayers, without their ability to see possibility, then this generation would maybe not even have been born to inherit the land with Joshua. And if he can turn the hearts of the children to their fathers in spite of their mistakes, maybe they would also turn to him and pray those same audacious prayers for him. I mean, did you hear what Moses said? You know what? If you kill all these people, then all the nations are just going to make fun of you and say you weren't able to bring them out and do anything with them. I mean, that's audacious prayer. And I think he's bringing these things up by design. Maybe this generation would turn and pray for me to cross the Jordan, the way that I interceded for their parents, the way that I prepared the way for them to be able to cross over Jordan. And so something I think it's easy to forget is that even though one generation might receive credit for some great act of faith in a battle, in a building, in a great time of repentance, if we look back at the history, those shining moments are only possible sometimes because of the failures of the previous generation, because of an incomplete commandment, because of a hopeless prayer. Look how many hopeless prayers the prophets had to pray. But those same prayers gave the people hope for a return so that they would return. And that's not saying we have encouragement or permission to sin or to fail. But we will. And when we do, it should be an inspiration to repent and to continue preparing for the kingdom as if it's going to be inaugurated in your days, just like David prepared as if the temple would be built in his day. Reuben did the mitzvah as if he would be able to rescue Joseph. Moses taught the people as if he would establish the refuge cities. So this faithfulness to a commandment that we see in faith will be honored in the days of Messiah. Don't despair. Don't feel like you've lived an incomplete life. What you have done in faith is not going to be seen in the context of all the failures that surrounded it. It's going to be seen in the days of Messiah as the shining diamond it is, without all the jagged edges. It's going to be just like Balaam. When he saw that vision of Israel's tents, he said they were lovely, perfect, and without fault. And we know better. But see, he had to lift his eyes and see the result thousands of generations later. And that's what we have to believe, is that when Hashem cuts a diamond, those jagged edges just fall away. When he refines gold, the impurities are skimmed away. Sometimes that's all we see or feel are jagged edges and impurities. But I think he's saying to us, pray those hopeless prayers. If they're my will, they're not hopeless. And in the days of Messiah, you will see the reward of those prayers. Keep the mitzvah today that you can't do perfectly. That's not in an ideal place, not in an ideal situation. And in the days of Messiah, you're going to see that mitzvah completed, and you're going to see how many lives were changed because of what you thought was failure, was incompletion. So we'll stop there because of time.